Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and joining me once again, PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate the Great Jahnke. Nate, first week of preseason is in the books. We're on the verge of week 2 now. You feeling back in the swing of things after writing up all those game recaps this weekend?
Oh, yeah, definitely having the game recaps, doing the snap counts, doing the player participation, trying to figure out who all these players are that are like, when the Rams game, for example, when they don't even have not just their starters in the game, but their top backups in the game, which they've done this like every year. So I knew right away it was like, okay, here are these wide receivers that are like 7th, 8th, and 9th on the depth chart, and 3rd and 4th running back, and 3rd and 4th tight end. So it was fun doing all that. And also like the new kickoff rule, just spent yesterday doing a deep dive into what teams are trying to do, what their strategy is, what the kicker strategy is. That article will be out tomorrow. So that was also fun, having just like this completely new thing that could be either huge for some fantasy leagues or completely nothing if teams just kick, or if teams just accept touchbacks all the time, then it's going to lead to no fantasy points on kick return. So it's either going to be this huge thing or not, or anywhere in between. So it's going to be a fun adventure this season with that.
Yeah, I think it's an important piece, though, right? Because I agree. Like, I think it's more likely that we, get more kick returns and stuff this year. And there's definitely plenty of fantasy leagues that include kick return yardage, in their scoring. And especially for like IDP leagues too, like some of those defensive players have a little bit more value as well because they're returning kicks. So there's definitely plenty of those deeper leagues that's going to be relevant for. So yeah, important piece there for coming out. You said tomorrow on the website. Nice. Check that out. But today we're talking running backs, but not just any running backs. We're focusing on the handcuff running backs, so the RB2s of each team, and kind of focusing on what their current roles are as those team RB2s, how valuable they might be for fantasy in that role, and then how valuable they might be should their starter miss any time during the fantasy season. So Nate, you wrote up the article. It's up on pff.com right now, so people can check that out. But we're going to go through every single team here. You've broken them down into tiers. What was kind of your rationale for including the players that you did and breaking them down into the tiers that they live in right now that we'll get into?
Sure. So I had one running back for every team. I kind of imagined a world where all 32 teams, the running back that was the starter or the player that would play the first play of the game, they are no longer available. They retired or are an injured reserve or whatever, and how I would rank all the running backs from there after that. And it was all the players that I thought would lead the team in rushing attempts after that. So like you could argue, for example, the Broncos, Samaje Perine is potentially second on the depth chart because he's going to be seeing the second most snaps. But if something were to happen to Williams, it would be one of the other running backs who sees a lot more attempts, and it would just be Samaje Perine continuing to take those passing down snaps. So it was looking at the player who would get the most rushing attempts after the top player went down.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? I mean, this is a good topic to cover. Like, I'm looking forward to this. I think it's a very valuable exercise and valuable information that we're going to need this season, right? Especially when you consider, the injury rates for the running back position. A lot of these guys that we're going to talk about today are going to see the field because that's just kind of the nature of the position. And, while we don't know exactly which ones or when or for how long, we can at least hopefully get you prepared for all of them and what to expect kind of if/when they are called upon. So looking forward to that. Before we get into our list, I do want to remind everyone to head over to pff.com. If you want to dominate your fantasy league this season, you can use code FANTASY25 to get 25% off your PFF annual subscription. You'll gain access to our fantasy mock draft simulator, draft rankings, live draft assistant. You could use in-season tools like My Team Dashboard for start-sit decisions, matchup charts, and more to stay on top of your roster. We'll feature weekly waiver wire targets, buy low, sell high advice, rest of season rankings, and more. So definitely go to subscribe.pff.com and use code FANTASY25 at checkout, or click the link in the episode description. All right, Nate, you have done a bang-up job in breaking down every immediate backup / RB2 for every single team heading into the 2024 season. It's worth noting that some of these situations maybe haven't been fully locked in yet. We only have 1 week of that preseason data, and teams can still move guys around, cut players, sign players, all that fun stuff. So with that in mind, we can start at the top where there isn't much likelihood of a shakeup in the backfield. Nate, a grouping that you have dubbed better than the starter, which I love. We got 3 running backs in this top grouping. Jahmyr Gibbs, with the presumed starter being David Montgomery in Detroit, Devon Achane, technically behind Raheem Mostert in Miami, and in Pittsburgh, it's Jaylen Warren as the RB2 behind Najee Harris. So I guess the first question here is, which of these backs do you feel is most likely to kind of take over as the clear RB1 on their team by season's end, maybe? Since we assume, the cream rises to the top of the bunch, right?
Oh yeah, with all 3 of them projecting them right now to score more points than the starter, the person who's going to play on the first and 10 of the game. So all of them, I expect them to score plenty of fantasy points. So it's kind of hard to consider them handcuffs because you're already drafting them to be your fantasy starters. But I did want one running back on each team. And to answer your question, I think it's going to be Gibbs has the best chance to take that first snap. Jaylen Warren was the other one that I'd really consider, but in Pittsburgh, in the first preseason game, we saw a rotation that looked very similar to what we saw in the regular season last year. I was kind of surprised that we didn't see more of like Arthur Smith's touch on how that backfield could shape up. So it was interesting to see a very familiar rotation there, considering like the tight ends was definitely an Arthur Smith kind of rotation, what they did at tight ends in the preseason game. But I think with Gibbs, we have seen that he's capable of doing everything. There were those 2 weeks in the middle of the season last year where David Montgomery was injured and like Gibbs kind of was a little bit slow to start at the beginning of the season. So in those 2 games, like Gibbs scored more than 50 fantasy points. He was the overall running back 1 in those 2 games. He was playing 60 or more snaps in both of those games. So I think he is definitely capable of having that like workhorse role where he's featured in every situation. It's just a matter of how much the Lions want to rest him and keep him fresh. But like David Montgomery, he didn't necessarily grade the best for us. And like his stats look very good, but a lot of that has to do with the Lions offensive line being one of the best offensive lines in the league. So I think the offensive line gets a lot more, or deserves a lot more credit for what the Lions run game was doing over Montgomery. So I think if any of them take the lead role and are playing on 1st and 10 this year on the very first play of games, it would be Gibbs. And that's a big reason why Gibbs is like either a late 1st round, early 2nd round draft pick.
Yeah, I think he's being drafted as RB4 right now. So I agree. I think Gibbs definitely makes the most sense. I think the player that probably is the most interesting to me for this group, because obviously I agree that, yeah, each of these guys better than the back listed as the RB1 on the depth chart, but only one of them is actually being drafted after that supposed RB1, right? It's Jaylen Warren, who's going nearly 2 rounds after Najee Harris on Sleeper. Harris is, I think, RB23 by ADP. Warren is RB32. So when we're looking at like this first tier and talking about guys that I think have the best chance to maybe return the most value, Warren kind of stands out as like a clear target in drafts for me right now. And I know he does for you as well. Like I know you wrote him up as a breakout, right? Like the first preseason game has already shown us that it's likely going to be a split workload again. Najee, I think, played the first 2 plays. Warren came in for a stretch of like 4 snaps after that, including 3rd down, 2nd drive. Najee played on 1st and 2nd. Warren played on 3rd. They rotated again on the 3rd drive. And Warren played, I think, the lone 3rd down there. But yeah, they're like by the end of the first preseason, there was 17 snaps total between the 2 of them. They split it 9-8. So again, in a case like that, where we essentially know at this point that Warren is the better running back, he outperformed Najee across the board last season in pretty much every metric, really. Like it's going to be a run heavy offense as well. I just feel like Warren is kind of just such an obvious bargain right now in drafts.
Yeah, and like not that I'd ever wish injury on anyone, but we haven't seen Najee Harris miss a game in his NFL career. We've seen what the Lions backfield looks like when Montgomery's hurt. We've seen what the Dolphins backfield looks like with Mostert hurt. It would be nice to see how much the Steelers would be willing to rely on Warren in the case of Harris has to miss a game for whatever reason. But we just haven't seen it at this point because one of the good things about Harris is he's been very dependable so far throughout his career.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, your next tier, Nate, includes 6 players who we'd expect to kind of step into a full-time role should the starter go down. So we got Tyler Algier, who's behind Bijan Robinson in Atlanta. Blake Corum is behind Kyron Williams for the Rams. Austin Eckler is behind Brian Robinson in Washington. Chase Brown behind Zach Moss in Cincinnati. Tajay Spears behind Tony Pollard in Tennessee. And Antonio Gibson behind Ramondre Stevenson in New England. So this group feels like one where we're still going to see these guys mixed in with the starter, so they could potentially hold some flex value like in deeper leagues. So for this group, which of these kind of handcuffs, I guess, stands out to you as the one that you're most likely to target in drafts, even if you don't have like the de facto RB1 on your roster, I guess?
Oh yeah, with handcuffs in general, I'm fine picking them up even if you don't have the
Mm-hmm.
starter. But it's the Tyler Algier and Blake Corum, the top two that like are true considered handcuffs. With Algier, he's been a top 10 running back by PFF grade over the past 2 seasons, so he's graded very well in our system. The offensive line is very good in Atlanta, so that's been a positive for them. And they don't really have a strong third running back on the roster. I know they drafted someone, but I would expect Algier to take the vast majority of snaps. I know he's kind of known more as a rusher. He wasn't really used much in pass situations last year, but in his rookie season, he did play a decent amount in passing situations. So I would expect him to have that full-time role, and the combination of that role, the grade that he's received, as well as the offensive line, has him as the top handcuff in this group. And then Corum, a similar thing with the Rams, where we think Corum's good based on what he did in college, but it's really Sean McVay's commitment to having a clear RB1, regardless of who that RB1 is. Wrote up in the article, remembering Darrell Henderson last season when Kyron Williams went down. Darrell Henderson, who had not been on a roster, he was cut by the Jaguars in December of the previous year. No futures contract, no 90-man roster, no practice squad, just signed up by the Rams, given like 60 touches over the course of 4 games. And then they were nice enough to leave him on the practice squad for a month or 2 after that, but then cut him before the end of the season. Hasn't been on a roster since. And while that's just one example, like we've seen other examples over these past couple of years where the starting running back gets injured, and even if it's not a big name player, they end up having that kind of feature role in the offense. So I expect Corum, if something were to happen to Kyron Williams, Corum would jump right into that role, see a ton of touches, potentially 20 carries in games. So if that happens, I'd expect Corum to be a potential top 10 fantasy running back, and is like my favorite example of the year of like why you look at fantasy rankings and not projections at this time of the year. Cause like Corum is not projected to do well, but it's that chance of running backs get injured all the time. So if Williams does get injured, then Corum's all of a sudden top 10, where there's a bunch of other running backs where we'll talk about them throughout the rest of this. If the starter gets injured, they're not going to see that same workload.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of how we picture like a typical handcuff running back, right? Somebody that could kind of step in and take that workload immediately, work as a really good replacement for us for fantasy purposes. And then on the other side of that, like in this tier, like I think there's a couple options as well who I think at least have the potential to emerge as the RB1, similar to the guys like in tier 1, but understandably not nearly as strong as those first 3 names that we covered. But Tajay Spears in Tennessee, Chase Brown in Cincinnati, it really seems like both of these guys are going to get a good mix of work along with the starters, just from kind of reports in camp and from what we saw in the preseason, at least for Tennessee. Pollard and Spears both got touches through those first 2 drives. Pollard did get more work, but Spears does figure to get his touches once again. We saw that last year with Derrick Henry, even on the team. I tend to think Pollard can definitely bounce back from last season's, specifically the slow start that really kind of threw him off course. But if not, like Spears looks like he has the ability to kind of carry that load and take the majority of snaps if need be. Same thing with Chase Brown. Like if Zach Moss is ineffective, I don't think he's going to have nearly as long of a leash that Joe Mixon had during his time in Cincinnati when he wasn't putting up, super efficient rushing metrics by any mean. Like I can definitely see them putting more on the plate of a Canadian hero like Chase Brown. And this is, from someone who had Zach Moss as a breakout candidate as well. Like I'm willing to go whichever way that the wind is blowing in that Cincinnati situation, because I think it is a valuable role. So, if it's a cold northern wind coming off Lake Ontario in favor of Chase Brown, then yeah, I'm willing to follow in that direction. So, shout out to all our Canadian listeners there. But I do like Chase Brown a fair bit as well.
Yeah, and for all we know, he's already the starter. I think Eckler fits in that exact same conversation. We saw that like big rotation in the preseason game. I think Gibson's probably the other interesting one that I felt a little surprised to put there, but it's worth noting that with the Patriots, like Gibson signed a pretty decent contract with them. I know Stevenson signed this huge contract with them, but like Gibson's making more than Zach Moss, for example. He's making more than some of these other running backs that were signed to be part of these rotations. So the Patriots definitely value him in this offense, expect him to have that passing down role and the primary backup role. But if something were to happen to Stevenson, they haven't really invested in their depth at running back beyond those first two spots these past couple of years. They've been fine having a veteran to go along with Stevenson. And then beyond that, it's like Kevin Harris, who they've had as a backup on the roster that's never really gotten this huge opportunity with the team. So Gibson, we saw early in his career be the primary rushing back for Washington and then switch to being the primary receiving back for him. So we know he's capable of doing everything in an offense. So I think he fits that description of someone. And this entire tier 2 is all people that we'd expect to be a feature back if the starter goes down. And I think Gibson fits that description.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout out because, it's not one that I think is very obvious, right, to a lot of people. But like you said, it makes a lot of sense considering the backfield there in New England. And Gibson has had that history in the past at the very least. So I do like that call quite a bit. All right, tier 3 consists of one man and one man only, Jordan Mason of the San Francisco 49ers, who is the presumed handcuff to the number 1 overall pick in non-Superflex fantasy drafts this offseason, Christian McCaffrey. So Nate, what's got Jordan Mason in a tier of his own versus, being put in like an every down tier or one of the other tiers, I guess?
Yeah, so there's been talk recently of him taking over as the number 2 spot over Elijah Mitchell, which has been like people saying nothing against Mitchell. It's just Mason is playing that well. And every time that we have seen him on the field in an NFL game, we've seen it too. He is our highest graded running back over the past 2 years when you don't filter out running backs at small sample sizes, which a lot of those running backs at the top do end up getting there on small sample sizes. Keith Mitchell's up there, Devon Achane's up there, but those are the running backs who have graded the best on a per play basis, and Mason is right there. So it's hard to know because we haven't seen the 49ers without CMC since they traded for him, so we don't know how they will distribute snaps among their backups. Traditionally, they've had an early down back and a third down back, but it's been a while since we've seen that kind of rotation from them. So I think Mason, I considered having him in a group that's more expect a 2-man committee because we don't know how much Mitchell would play in there. But Mason just played so well that I needed to have him above those guys and above some of these other guys. And especially considering the 49ers drafted a running back in the 4th round this year. They have Kyle Juszczyk as well, who's capable of being the third down running back if they need him to. I don't know if there's a spot for Elijah Mitchell on the roster if he's not the number 2 running back. Hasn't played much special teams, so he'd have to play special teams if he was going to stay on the roster as the number 3 running back. It's just a numbers game of some teams are able to keep 4 running backs and a fullback, but that means one less roster spot somewhere else on the roster. And if they release him, I assume someone else would pick him up. So there's also a chance that, assuming Mason does win this number 2 job, like it sounds like he is winning it right now, that Mitchell wouldn't be on the roster, in which case I would expect Mason to be either an every down back or at least everything but third downs, which the research I did on utilization this offseason, it's okay if a running back's not playing specifically on third downs. It's the 2-minute drill that ends up being a bit more important for passing down roles, and that's something that Mason could do, but we just haven't seen it yet of what CMC has actually stayed healthy after years of not staying healthy and everyone thinking he's injury prone. Now he hasn't been missing games.
Yeah, funny how that works, right? But yeah, I agree. Mason, he's definitely looked good, when he was out there on the field. My concern is Yeah, kind of what you alluded to, right? Like if something were to happen to Christian McCaffrey, it's probably more of a two-man unit with like either Elijah Mitchell or Kyle Juszczyk or Isaac Guerendo, like whoever, right? But on the chance that it isn't, and Mason gets like a decent workload similar to McCaffrey, then he's worth the risk. I think gambling on him for that alone, right? Especially considering the offense. So yeah, I kind of love that Mason gets his own tier for those reasons. I think it makes a lot of sense as someone who could become super valuable. Even if Elijah Mitchell does stick on the roster and get an uptick in usage if McCaffrey were to miss time, which I'm with you, it does feel unlikely if that's the case. But yeah, it just there's I think a lot of kind of hidden value there in Jordan Mason. McCaffrey also dealing with a calf injury right now, won't appear in the preseason, so something to monitor there. But does seem like he'll be back for week one at the very least. Tier 4 is also interesting because it's a smaller tier for you. You've labeled these guys with the possibility of being in a two-man rotation, right? So with another backup on the team where, for example, the names that we have here, Braylon Allen of the New York Jets behind Breece Hall and potentially sharing time with Isaiah Davis. You got Zach Charbonnet of the Seattle Seahawks behind Kenneth Walker, potentially sharing time with Kenny McIntosh. And with good news on his injury scare yesterday, Tyrone Tracy joins this tier along with Eric Gray behind Devin Singletary of the New York Football Giants. So preseason usage from these three teams appeared to kind of help sort out these situations a little better. Any reason to believe they could still change, or are you feeling pretty comfortable about these three depth charts right now?
Oh, yeah, that's probably where I expect them to be. Teams, when it comes to running backs in the preseason, there's two predominant strategies that teams will utilize. For example, Washington, how they use their running backs is how I expect them to use their running backs in the regular season. We saw Brian Robinson playing the majority of rushing down situations, Eckler playing the majority of passing down situations, a little bit of blend between the two, but that's basically what we expect. Denver was another one. We saw Javonte Williams play the early downs. Samaje Perine played the third downs. They're playing their running backs in the role that they expect them to be in the regular season. We're probably not going to see Perine have that early down role at any point. We're probably not going to see Williams get those third down snaps, even though it would be nice to see him get those third down snaps. But that's how some teams use their running backs. Other teams, it's here's our first guy. We're going to play him every down on this drive or maybe this other drive. Then they're going to go to the second team back, have them play, then the third team and have them play. Maybe once they get to the backups, because it's like, hey, they're going to play the entire second half, rotate them a little bit more, but it's give the running back every situation that they could possibly be in and not give a sense of how the rotation might work. And that is what these three teams did in the preseason. It was here, they rested their starters, all three of them. Then they're like, here's our second guy, let the second guy play. Then here's our third guy, and let the third guy play. And all of these, it's either a combination of new coaches, new backup running backs. We don't know exactly how the rotation might look after there's an injury to the starter. We just know this guy is the clear new number one guy. Someone else will be the clear number two guy. But there's a decent enough chance that there's not a huge gap between the second and third guy that we'll see some kind of rotation. It's just really hard to tell because there's a lot of unknown there. So that's how they ended up in this tier. Is they could be the every down guy that could be huge for them, which is why they're pretty intriguing late round draft picks. But there's also a chance that it could just be a two-back committee and be a little bit more stressful that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of kind of looking at all three of these guys. Really, I mean, Tyrone Tracy, I'm glad that the injury thing didn't. Well, apparently not super serious, right? They're saying potentially low ankle sprain, could be back in a couple weeks here. But I do really like his kind of potential. Like if I'm looking at these guys with maybe some flex potential in deeper leagues, like he was somebody that I wrote up post draft as a rookie sleeper back in like early May. He's been getting a lot of hype recently before that injury, and then especially following the preseason. Now he got the start over Eric Gray, who also looked very good. But Tracy's interesting, like converted wide receiver out of Purdue and Iowa before that, really explosive and kind of elusive with the ball in his hands. Obviously, being that former wide receiver, I think is what gives him kind of the best chance to see some passing down work over someone like Devin Singletary as the starter. But like you said, Gray also has the potential to get there as well when we were talking earlier in the week. And I think for me, it's probably another potentially kind of ambiguous situation where if Singletary does go down, we should probably expect to see both Gray and Tracy kind of split the work. But I think, in the case of right now with Singletary healthy, like I think Tracy could hold value in those deeper leagues if he ends up being used as that primary receiving back, of which he was sounding like the favorite, in camp again before he got hurt. And I think it helps him, his case at least when he got the start over Eric Gray in preseason week 1 there. So someone to keep an eye on, I guess, for sure, especially once he gets back healthy.
Oh yeah, and he was someone where like earlier draft of this article, it was Eric Gray, and I had to change the article after more injury news was coming in, so we went back and forth there. The last year that we'll talk about is guys where we're think if the starter gets injured, they'll probably bring in a free agent. The Giants felt like they almost fit in that category just because, like you said, he's the converted wide receiver, more of a receiving back. And then Eric Gray, when he came out of college, that was what we thought of him. We thought he was a receiving back. So it's even possible that this is a situation where if something were to happen to Singletary, they might bring in someone to play on early downs and then Tracy play a lot on more passing situations. So that's also just kind of throws a wrench into what could possibly happen, which is why Tracy is at the bottom of these three in this tier.
Perfect. Hey everyone, we're just going to take a quick break to let you know that this episode of the PFF Fantasy Podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. In today's hectic world, it's easy to focus on everything except yourself and your own mental health. Sometimes you need a little help to help make sure that stays on track as well. Therapy can be really useful to get a better understanding of how your mind actually works and to become more aware of your own patterns of behavior and how to improve them. It's useful for everybody, not just people struggling with something specific. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a convenient, flexible, and entirely online way to get therapy that's right for you. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you could switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/PFFfantasy today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/PFFfantasy. All right, so tier 5 is an important one, I think, just to distinguish kind of from the every down tier from earlier, especially where we have a few names here where if the starter went down, these are running backs that we'd expect to take over kind of that early down and short yardage work, but not necessarily the third down or passing down work. So in this tier, you've included Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills, Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Dameon Pierce of the Houston Texans. So Nate, any one of the backs in this tier that you were maybe on the fence about that you thought maybe could get into that every down tier, but ultimately landed on the team just maybe having a better passing down option?
Yeah, because I was considering the every down tier, potentially someone who might not play on some third downs, but if they were going to take the 2-minute drill snaps, and that's been nearly as valuable for fantasy, I was generally okay with that. In the second tier, I think I was a little bit concerned with all of them, like Trey Benson. We saw in the Cardinals game, the rotation was exactly what it's been in regular season games for Arizona. Someone's the early down back, someone else is the third down back. We saw that it was with Carter and Benson, so the backups rather than potentially the starters, and Connor and Amari DiMercado. I don't know if it'll be DiMercado or Carter who ends up winning that third down role, but I expect if that happens, Benson would be the primary early down back, probably not play on third downs, and they might even take him out of third 2-minute drill situations, considering he's a younger back, and they might, there's been talk of him maybe not being the primary backup throughout training camp as well. So that's at least a possibility that could happen, but we also really are excited about Benson's talent. I think like Bigsby's another interesting one, since Dearness Johnson's the other running back in the backfield. He hasn't really traditionally been a third down back, but he did see more receiving work last year. A lot of that is like Bigsby on his plays that he was targeted, they were like comically bad of how bad they were of the ball just popping out of his hands and up and just landing right in a defender's hands. So a lot of not great stuff out of Bigsby as a receiver, but that all feels like stuff that should be fixable. Like if it's just one, like we talk about drops not being that big of a deal for wide receivers, running backs not being a predictable thing going forward. So if he just has that, like whatever he was missing to catch the ball, then all of a sudden he could be a significantly better player than he was last year. But considering we know him as a short down back, I saw a tweet earlier today of him getting work with the first team at goal line situations and scoring a touchdown there. And we think of him as like the best situation he is a short yardage back. So I would not be surprised if they limit him, considering there's all this talk of them wanting to limit Travis Etienne. And if Etienne were to suffer a season-long injury, it wouldn't be surprising if they had that same philosophy with Bigsby of not wanting to overwork him. But I think all of these guys, it's like they would be fantasy starters, but there would be that limit on their upside because they're probably all not catching that many passes.
Yeah, those are great points. And like I think Trey Benson is the one that, probably people are most excited about. Like you said, obviously being a, relatively highly drafted rookie, right? I think he's going 106th overall right now on Sleeper. So 9th round is where he's going. So relatively high draft capital for fantasy, especially considering that he is right now listed as the backup. But like you said, that backup role was kind of clearly defined in the preseason, right? Where he only took the early down work. And then Michael Carter played all of the third and even the 1/4 down snap there. So there's at least reason to kind of temper expectations even more for Trey Benson. And like you said, there was talk of like Emari DeMarcado potentially being ahead of him on the depth chart as well. He's hurt right now. So I don't know how much that's going to, translate to the next few weeks or so. But yeah, there's just, I think that's just an important one to kind of highlight and why he's in this tier for you, because I think a lot of people might envision him as like the immediate copy and paste replacement for James Conner if something were to happen to him, but doesn't necessarily show that way right now based on the preseason usage.
Yeah, and like Connor, he's not playing third downs. We're not drafting him in the top 15 running backs because he's not getting that passing down work. And he was excellent last year to lead to his fantasy production. So yeah, he might take the same role as Connor, but Connor is not necessarily a top 15 running back. So I wouldn't expect Benson to be either.
Right. Yep. It's a good call. Okay, tier 6 is an interesting one. And the biggest tier we have, actually, we got 8 names that are currently holding on to the RB2 role, but could get surpassed by a different running back further down the depth chart, whether it's, before the season, since there's still, I think, plenty of time left, especially for these rookies vying for those roles, or if it's in season where maybe someone plays themselves into a larger role. But our candidates for this tier are A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers, currently behind Josh Jacobs. Maybe Marshawn Lloyd has a shot there at some point. We also have Jaleel McLaughlin in Denver behind Javonte Williams. And then there's potential for, Samaje Perine or rookie Audric Estime to work in at some point. J.K. Dobbins of the Chargers behind Gus Edwards. Clyde Edwards-Helaire behind Isaiah Pacheco in Kansas City. Kenneth Gainwell behind Saquon Barkley in Philadelphia. Alexander Madison behind Zamir White in Vegas, and Jamal Williams behind Alvin Kamara in New Orleans. Oh, and Chase Edmonds behind Rashad White in Tampa Bay. So, Nate, a lot of these guys have to worry about rookies potentially coming in and stealing that workload. Anyone on here that you're watching in particular with the expectation that the name that you did include in this tier will be replaced sooner, I guess, rather than later?
Yeah, it's probably the guys. How I rank them is more or less the guys at the top. I'm less worried about, like with AJ Dillon. We have Marshawn Lloyd with the injury recently, and there was already talk that Dillon would potentially stay the number 2. And same thing happened in Dillon's rookie year, where like he was drafted in the 2nd round, but then was the 3rd running back the entire year for Green Bay. Where it's the guys at the bottom of the list that I'm most worried about. Chase Edmonds, we expect him to lose the job to Bucky Irving. I tried to do the best that I could to stick with how the depth chart looks right now rather than what could happen. But we've seen backup running back situations be very fluid throughout the preseason and then into the regular season. I've had multiple tweets comparing like past players who have played in the 4th quarter preseason games, both at running back and wide receiver. Running back, we had Achane, we saw McLaughlin, we saw Roshan Johnson, we saw Keaton Mitchell, and there's a 5th guy that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but all of them played in the 4th quarter of the first preseason game last year significantly, and then they all had decent-sized roles throughout the season, so we shouldn't worry too much about where the running backs are on the depth chart right now. Or wide receiver, I looked at all of them in the past 3 years, and there's like a no hit rate of no one becoming fantasy relevant, not even in their first year. But like Treylon Burks is the one interesting one because he was a first round pick and he's been a starter at least in the league at times, but it was not a great list of wide receivers. So I do think running backs can work their way up. Especially Bucky Irving, who served as the top running back in their preseason game. Chase Edmonds is out with an injury. We expect Irving to take over. It's just basically every other backfield, it was pretty clear who the number 2 guy is. So I'm like, let's just stick with who's there currently rather than projecting who I think will get there. So like Irving's the big one. And then with the Saints, like Kendre Miller, if he can stay healthy, then I would assume he'd be the number 2. Has had trouble with that throughout his career so far, but I believe he's still only like 22 years old. So he was very young for a running back starting his career. So still think there's time for him, but we could very well see a 3-man committee with the Saints that way.
Yeah, that's true. And then, yeah, I agree with all those. I think the other name for me, like the one that I'm kind of keeping an eye on, I think is Dylan Labe in Las Vegas with Alexander Madison. I think he's a really interesting player. I might be a bit biased with him because he was another one of those post-draft like rookie sleepers for me, but I think he just makes the most sense to kind of emerge as the lead passing down back there over Alexander Madison and over Amir Abdullah. I know we didn't see Labe until the second half in the preseason, the first game anyways. So very clearly behind those guys, but like I think if he's kind of the one where if I'm taking a flyer on these guys late, I in Vegas behind Zamir White, who again might not be a guaranteed full-time player for the entire season, I think Labe kind of makes the most sense for me. And like you said, there's potential for him to kind of move up the depth chart still. Like not all hope is lost. So like deep sleeper wise, I think he could be an interesting name as well to keep an eye on.
My thought with him is like I could very well see him earning that third down role this season sooner rather than later. Just I don't know if he would also then be the handcuff or if it would be Madison who takes over if Zamir White gets injured. And just a random side note, I am frustrated with the Raiders running backs because Alexander Madison went from a single digit to number 22. Amir Abdullah went from number 22 to a single digit. Amir Abdullah was the third down back last year. Then at the start of the preseason, it's Alexander Madison, who I wasn't expecting to be a third down back for them, taking the third down role. So getting me all confused of who was in at running back for the Raiders for a little bit. So that was one of the two fun trying to figure out running backs in the preseason outside of the Rams announcers getting Boston Scott confused and not knowing the difference between 20 and 30 for the first 7 minutes of the game.
Yes. Brings me back to the joys of player participation. Sometimes trying to struggle with who these guys are on the field at times, but that is a weird shift to make there. But I guess the one other running back room of interest kind of in this tier is the Chargers, like where we know they're gonna run the ball a ton under Greg Roman. Gus Edwards looks set to be the lead back there. J.K. Dobbins is apparently healthy, though that has been a struggle to kind of maintain that health for him. And then everyone's favorite post-draft rookie sleeper, Kamani Vidal, is now apparently on the roster bubble, potentially behind guys like Isaiah Spiller and Jared Patterson. So, with this kind of Kamani Vidal news, his stock going down right now, are you any more comfortable with taking a flyer on like a J.K. Dobbins who's going in the 12th to 13th round on sleeper right now in 1 QB leagues? He's going around guys like Aaron Rodgers, Kendre Miller, Gabe Davis, Josh Palmer. Any chance you're taking Dobbins over one or more of those guys?
He was the guy that outside of the Giants situation, which was just evolving throughout the day yesterday, he was the one that I was kind of moving up and down throughout the day, trying to wrap my head around what I really thought about him, since I think with all of the injuries he's had throughout his career, he's bound to, if there's an injury to Gus Edwards, not see a feature role at the very least, because I don't think you can play him that much after all the injuries he's gone through and expect him to be successful. So I think someone has to be in that mix. I think we were just talking about we can see running back situations being fluid throughout the preseason. I'm definitely not willing to give up on any of the other backups with Los Angeles, but I wouldn't be surprised that if they do end up not being happy with their third string running back, that they could be a team looking to add another running back once we get to roster cutdown day, since plenty of these teams have too many running backs. So there's definitely going to be some running backs available that are moving teams. And I'd expect the Chargers to be a potential landing spot for a running back if they end up not being happy with their third string back.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not overly comfortable at Dobbins at cost right now. Like I like a couple other guys in there. Josh Palmer, Gabe Davis, I think have a little bit more interesting upside. But yeah, we'll see what happens with that Chargers running back situation. It feels like there could be a few guys involved this year, especially with how much they want to run the ball. So okay, a few more smaller tiers to go over now, heading to tier 7, which includes 2 running backs with the presumed starter already being hurt and likely to miss time to start the year. But they're still not guys that we're, I guess, overly excited about rankings wise. It's Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns and Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. So Nick Chubb, we know, sounds unlikely for week 1, though it's not like a guarantee right now, where it does at least seem more likely that the rookie Jonathan Brooks misses at least week 1 in Carolina. So Nate, the starters, they're out here. They might only get eased back in when they do return. So what's got you kind of tempering expectations on the Jerome Fords and Chuba Hubbards right now?
Yeah, like we know all this, and they're still not getting drafted among the top 35 running backs so far this year. I think with Cleveland, it's a lot of because we've seen this last year of them have a big rotation of running backs when Nick Chubb was out throughout the year. So we know Ford is a borderline fantasy starter without Chubb in the lineup. And then once he's there, it's possible Ford still stays as a borderline fantasy starter, just depending on how much they ease Chubb in when there's not really a timeline. So we don't know when he's going to come back. So, but because we know that there's that limit, they added Deonta Foreman, who should be capable of playing a significant role in the offense. We've seen it for a couple offenses the past couple of years where he's definitely capable of being a, maybe not 3-down guy, maybe not so much on passing downs, but still taking a lot of 2-down snaps. And they still have Pierre Strong. Expect him to make the roster because he appears to be the primary returner for the team. So very well could have 4 running backs on the roster. And then the Panthers, we saw Hubbard end of last year, he was a fantasy starter because he was in a feature role in the offense. I'm not sure that'll continue with the new coaching staff, though. They might view Miles Sanders a little more highly than what the other coaching staff did by the end of the season. So I could still see this being a 2-man committee, but we haven't seen them too much in the preseason. They were playing mostly backups in their games. So it would be nice to see the running backs play a little bit more in the preseason. This could be a situation where we could get a little bit more excited for Hubbard, depending on how he's mixed in with Sanders. But right now, it's easy to draft him. I do my perfect draft strategy articles. He's fairly consistently a guy in the 13th round where I'm yeah, this is a great time to get him because he can be a starter for you in week 1 potentially. So, but we don't, since we're in a world where all the starters are injured, lots of other running backs that we're more excited for, either because the offensive line is better or the offense is better or things like that.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. I think, between the two, Hubbard to me is probably the more enticing option, as a potential sleeper type player. We know Jonathan Brooks unlikely to start. We've seen Panthers new head coach Dave Canales rely heavily on someone like Rachaad White in Tampa Bay last year as well. We saw, Hubbard handle a heavy workload in the back half of last season. Like you said, he had, I think, 4 games with at least 22 carries between weeks 13 and the end of the season. So, I think it could be fair to assume too that, we see an ease in period for when Brooks is back healthy, coming off that ACL, and he does only have the 1 year of experience as a starter at Texas as well. So I think there's a good chance that the team, would view him as somebody that needs to be kind of worked in, and they're not just going to hand the keys to right away. So I do kind of like Chuba Hubbard's fantasy value right now. Like you said, 13th round, he's pretty much always there. Just somebody that if you're looking to fill out the back end of your roster with some depth and potential fantasy relevance there, I think Hubbard makes a lot of sense. So yeah, that's a good call. All right, tier 8 is another kind of 2-back tier that you've entitled the 2-man committee. So the couple of teams that we're feeling pretty sure there's a 2A and 2B behind the starter. So in Indianapolis, behind Jonathan Taylor, we could be looking at a combination of Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson. And then in Chicago, behind DeAndre Swift, we could be looking at both Roschon Johnson and Khalil Herbert. So Nate, Obviously, these guys rank way down here in the second to last tier because they're not really holding all that much value individually. And even if the starter does go down, we're not overly confident that these guys will be all that valuable outside of maybe some deeper leagues is kind of how I'm looking at them. So does that make sense in how to view this tier?
Oh yeah, like we saw in the Bears Hall of Fame game, it was Johnson and then Herbert, and they went back and forth the entire first half between the two. In the second game, they started to have roles more like the Shane Waldron offense, where they had running backs play on early downs, running backs play on third downs. But like we saw Travis Homer play the third down work with Khalil or with Roshan Johnson out. I would not be at all surprised if Homer has a role in this offense in the season, even when everyone's healthy as well, to make this a four-man committee. Like Shane Waldron has his guys. We saw that at tight end in the game, which I talked about plenty on Twitter. I don't need to go into anymore at this point, but it was the same thing. Homer was playing with the first team offense on third downs, and he has a history with Homer in Seattle for several years where we were always surprised that either Homer or DJ Dallas was seeing as much playing time as they were throughout their time in Seattle, because it was always, it's third down, they're putting in one of the receiving backs, no matter how much they like Chris Carson or Kenneth Walker. Luckily, eventually last year that became Zach Charbonnet, so we got to see some playing time out of Charbonnet last year, but it's a complicated backfield. And then the Colts, similarly, they saw injuries to both Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss late in the season. And then we saw both running backs see games where they saw double-digit carries. They're both still on the roster. Evan Hull, a former fifth-round pick, also in the mix as well. So I could, again, see that being a situation where, like, whoever has the hot hand, but both players will see playing time, or potentially three players could see playing time.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, just Chicago too. Like we saw this kind of inconsistent usage from them last year, where there were a few games of like heavy Deontay Foreman usage when there was no Herbert and sometimes no Roshan Johnson. But just the usage just varied pretty wildly. There were weeks when they worked Darrington Evans in there as well. So they've shown a pretty, a comfort in the rotation there under Eberflus. So you do wonder how much influence does Eberflus have in that as well? Like you said already, with Shane Waldron having his tendencies too. So I do agree. Like it's why I'm a little bit worried on DeAndre Swift as well, just because of that potential rotation there. And then, yeah, I definitely agree with the Colts being more of a split as well. Like neither of those guys or anybody else on the roster outside of Jonathan Taylor profiles as like or has been a workhorse back in the past. So this is kind of like a Jerome Ford light situation where I don't think they'd come close to Jonathan Taylor or Zach Moss's usage from last season. So they're not like overly exciting backups for me either. Okay, last tier now. These are the current handcuffs who we're feeling less than confident about, because if the starter goes down, these aren't the types of players that necessarily profile as starters, and that a coaching staff might feel comfortable deploying in a lead role of any kind. So it's more than likely they bring in help, a potential free agent running back to share the load there. So we're not investing too heavily at all in the current depth chart RB2s here. So we're looking at Ty Chandler in Minnesota, Rico Dowdle in Dallas, Justice Hill in Baltimore. Nate, those are the three names we have. But if you're in a deep league, the starter goes down, say example for one of these teams, it happens on a short week, it's close to kickoff. Is there anyone from this group that you'd actually feel kind of comfortable grabbing to plug into a lineup for that week right now?
If it's a short enough week that they can't bring in anyone else and it's a good matchup, then I'm probably comfortable with all three. Like Chandler is probably the one I'm most comfortable with. The big thing for me there is like I'm worried that they will add another running back. There was talk that they were going to re-sign Cam Akers if he passed his physical. I don't know what happened there, but Akers ended up with Houston, and even then, like he hasn't worked his way up the Texans depth chart yet. So if that continues to be the case, Akers will be available again in a couple weeks from now. So I would not be surprised if they add someone else, and especially if something happens with Aaron Jones. But it looks like right now they are trusting Aaron Jones to be the guy. So that's a concern there. Like Dallas, we already know that they might add a running back once we get to cut down day, even without any injuries. Of course, like Dowdle could win the starting job, and then Elliott's a backup, but a similar thing where if Dowdle's the starter, Elliott's a backup, and then Dowdle goes down, ideally they bring in someone else. And with the Ravens, I was taking Keaton Mitchell out of the equation somewhat because we don't know when he'll be back, probably mid-season at best, and of course Mitchell would be the guy. if that does happen. But we've seen plenty in 2022, 2021, Ravens running backs get injured. They're perfectly happy to bring in a veteran to ease that workload. And they have a lot of faith in Hill, but I think they have a lot of faith of Hill more so as a receiver. He has seen plenty of carries at times when they've needed him to, but I don't think they would want that to be a long-term solution for their running backs. So I think they would bring in a veteran if we did see Derrick Henry go down before the point where Keaton Mitchell can come back.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And yeah, just kind of reading between the lines of, I think you're potentially manifesting Elijah Mitchell to Dallas at some point. We talked about him maybe not making the 49ers, Dallas bringing in a free agent, Elijah Mitchell being a good running back. Maybe that's a fun fit. But if not, like, I think Rico Dowdle, I think he makes a lot of sense as well. Like, in this tier, just given the offense and the true lack of options behind him. Like, if I were to have to start somebody, like there could be some nice goal line work and pass down work if Zeke were to miss time as well. Like, that's probably the one I'm be most interested in, even with Ezekiel Elliott healthy. Like, he might be worth the flyer just because of the offense and with the team's kind of apathy in this free agent market right now. Like, you just never know. But yeah, if he falls, I that's what's gonna do it for me. Like, I don't love the ADP right now. He's kind of in that same J.K. Dobbins range that we talked about earlier, and like you said, the likelihood of them bringing in a free agent seems pretty high at this point. Once rosters start to kind of form a little bit better, but still somewhat of an interesting name. If you can get him at a relatively cheap price.
Yeah, definitely of the three, he's the one to draft because he has a chance to be the starter, where Ty Chandler does not have a chance to be the starter. Justice Hill, I think they called him a starter, whatever, but he's the third down back for Baltimore. So he'll see 50% of snaps, 45% of snaps potentially this season, but Derrick Henry will get the ball like all the time when he's on the field. Justice Hill will rarely get the ball when he's on the field. So we know that even though he's going to see a lot of snaps, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get a lot of touches.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that Lamar's going to dump the ball off either. We know he's going to probably most likely scramble and take off with it, right? So there's not a ton of value there. But that's going to do it for us today. I hope you all found that helpful in kind of sorting through the potentially later stages of your draft for the most part, and which kind of handcuffs to target or avoid depending on the size of your league. But Nate, big shout out to you for putting this list together so we can kind of go through them all. You've also written up this article for PFF.com, like we said, as if the people want to go check that out as far as being able to read and have that list handy. But let us know what everything else that you have going on at PFF.com this week.
Oh, yeah, I mentioned at the start, the kickoff article that should be going out tomorrow, a deep dive into what the strategies both the return teams use, that the kickers use, what we can expect, even though, like, with the preseason in general, you're taking things with a little bit of a grain of salt. And since this is a brand new thing, take it with a big grain of salt. But people want to know if they should be drafting some of these players. So that'll be going out tomorrow. Along with that, I've been going through breakout candidates at each position, continuing the perfect draft strategy articles for 12-team leagues. That's been going out this week. And then, of course, the preseason recaps have been going out roughly during halftime of games, since the backups will play after halftime. So I'm not as concerned what's happening in the second half of games. So recaps going out much earlier than you'll find them anywhere else. And we'll continue that this weekend. We got one game Thursday. For whatever reason, they're giving me Friday night off. And then Saturday, we're getting like 13 games all in one day. So it'll feel like a regular season that day, except there's going to be like 6 or 7 or 8 night games, something like that. So that'll be a nice fun night for me on Saturday night, and then 2 games Sunday night.
Yeah, it'll be a busy Saturday for sure. As for me, I've written up my top fades at wide receiver and running back for PFF.com after doing my favorite values at each position last week. I'll also have another couple articles this week looking at the safest pick by round and most high risk, high reward pick by round as well. Some fun pieces to check out if you're interested in that. Also recorded a YouTube exclusive short form video covering the perfect draft strategy for super flex leagues when picking 10 to 12. We did picks 1 to 3 about a month ago, and there was interest for more, so people can check that out as well. If you are an audio only listener, you can find that on our YouTube. Nate, you also recorded the top 10 preseason takeaways as a YouTube exclusive as well, which we're going to keep doing throughout the offseason, it feels like, as well. So definitely go check all that out. I'll be back in the podcast feed on Friday talking 3 down linebackers for the IDP crowd. So be on the lookout for that. And until next time, peace out.